So like Chris mentioned, I'm a product designer at Paycor, been in the community for a little while, and just have been talking with Kat for a while prior to undertaking the survey, just about what it's like to be a UX product designer in the community, and I'm excited to share our findings with you.
And just want to introduce myself since I haven't gotten a chance to say hi yet. I'm Kat, and like Amy said, we've been working on this for a while now, so I'm excited to be able to finally give it voice.
Great. So before we dive into the data, just wanted to give you a little bit of background on our thinking prior to actually designing the survey and sending it out among the community. So like I mentioned, Kat and I had talked quite a bit just about, what it's like to be in this profession in the Cincinnati area. We both felt like that UX is just a great career path in general, combining skills like empathy, problem solving, critical thinking, skills that we felt could really be acquired in a variety of ways. We felt that the UX people in the community that we knew really seemed to draw from just a range of backgrounds and experience and skill sets. But we felt like in the course of our careers that, a lot of the job postings that we saw in the community had some really specific qualifications or experience levels that they were requiring. And we had this question that sort of drove our research to a certain extent, wondering if, there just might be a little bit of a mismatch between kind of the very specific types of experience and backgrounds that are sometimes asked for and job postings locally for the UX designer, product designer type of roles versus what actual community members' experiences are. And so just want to say to everybody on the call who took our survey, which was lengthy, we realize we very much appreciate your participation and taking the time to fill it out. We piloted the survey pre-COVID, and then of course in the March, April, May timeframe, coming into May, where it just became really clear that things had changed and it was going to probably be quite a while that we would be living fairly differently. That's when we decided that we needed to adapt our questions. And so we included some specific questions around just working in our profession in this very particular time before launching it. And we spent about a year, a little over a year, asking colleagues, social media connections, hitting up participants at local UX events to take the survey. We collected around 100 responses, but ended up with just 80 usable responses rather. And so, yeah, just excited to share the information with you tonight. We do want to mention that these respondents, of course, represent our own professional networks and connections in a lot of ways. So, it's possible that these results may not necessarily be indicative of the entire, community, UX community at large in the area. But we gathered a lot of really interesting responses, and we think that you'll enjoy learning more about what our respondents told us. So we asked participants questions about their educational background and training, such as whether they had a degree in a UX or design related area, and whether they had an undergraduate versus graduate level degree, as well as about some more general training that they felt was instrumental to their profession. What we found is that the majority of us have some type of design-based education, holding at least one UX or design-related degree. And 20% of participants studied completely unrelated subjects and did not hold any type of, design-related degree. Less than 2% also didn't specify a degree type, but overall, a very educated group of people in our survey participants. So if we look at the nearly 80% of the design related or UX degrees, the most frequent design related degree that participants cite is specifically UX related. It's about a third of our respondents. But then the majority of the design related degrees are not UX related. In fact, some could argue that the graphic and communication type design degrees, which is the second most frequent, is less UX related than some of the least frequent responses like the media informatics or the digital and interaction design. And then if we look at the level of degree, the majority or most frequent design or UX related degree was an undergraduate level. And then it was a tie. We had an equal number of participants who had both an undergraduate design or UX related degree and a master's. And then we also had, that same number who specifically had a design related master's degree. But when we look at the US overall, there aren't a huge number of colleges and universities that are actually offering UX specific degrees. Out of the close to 4,000 degree granting institutions throughout the US, only 45 actually offer UX degrees, with the majority sort of being clustered on the East Coast, a few in the Midwest area, and then in California as well. And then the levels of degrees that are offered that are UX specific are largely masters and above, and then some undergraduates, which was a little surprising to me, just given that the UX profession is growing so much in popularity. I'd sort of anticipated that the undergraduate degrees available would have been growing a lot more as well. And then when we look at the non-design degree holders from our survey respondents, there's a pretty good mix. And we see we've got, 20% overall, and they range from, liberal arts types of degrees like English, art history, even a theology major in there, to maybe some more related like psychology or computer science. And but the diversity of the kind of non-design degree holders seems to indicate that it's very possible for people without a UX or design related degree to make a profession in our industry here in Cincinnati. And then so we did ask, outside of UX and design related degrees, what type of training was really instrumental. And so, at the top, we've got like the degree holders. Obviously those degrees are influential, but there are still like a huge number of people that cite self-education, on-the-job training, boot camps, et cetera, as being really instrumental to their professional development. And so one thing that sort of occurs to me is that, local employers might also want to think in some of their job descriptions just about, citing preferences for candidates with UX related degrees. One, because there's a kind of a lack of UX related degrees available in the US, but also because it seems like there's just a core, like a kind of instrumental learning that is taken both on the job through self-education, boot camps, et cetera, that seems like it's been a really crucial part of people's development. And then I also want to mention just another sort of research angle that we took looking into local companies' job postings for UX design positions. We analyzed UX designer job postings from 15 local employers during the month of May. And these postings used a variety of different titles, including product designer, UX designer, digital designer, but each of the 15 that we studied consistently requested similar types of skill sets and experience. And we also focused on the UX designer level job, but there were a fair number of senior level postings in the community, but very few junior level postings, maybe just a couple that we saw during the month of May. And the companies that we looked at included companies like P&G, Kroger, Paycor, GE, Engage Partners, Atomic Robot, and some others as well. And the actual job descriptions mostly didn't specify that a degree was required. So just very few said that the UX or design related degree was specifically required. However, the majority of them did use language such as UX or design degree preferred, or UX degree or equivalent experience. And then the actual amount of experience that they were looking for this kind of mid-level, just plain UX designer job role, seemed like it was fairly large in terms of, there being about a third of these employers that were looking for 3+ years experience, and even 13% looking for 6+ years experience. And if we actually decode that phrase, UX bachelor's degree or equivalent, you find that according to some sources, that's roughly equivalent to 4 to 8 years of work experience. So given that companies don't seem to offer many junior level positions, or and also seem to require so much experience for these UX kind of mid-level designer positions, it is a little bit hard to imagine how people without a UX or design related degree plus years of job experience can break into the profession. And just this morning, there was a post that I was reading on the UX Collective blog that was talking about just how difficult in general it is to break into the UX profession. And they were kind of positing that some of it may be due to companies still having a little bit of a mentality that UX might be sort of a luxury, and maybe they don't offer just as many UX positions as other types of positions. They also mentioned that the role just seems to be surging in popularity. There's a lot of stiff competition. There are instances they cited of actual kind of junior positions or even internships being posted and receiving like 200-300 inquiries about them, in a single day. So it is a highly demanded position, it seems like, and also a difficult one to break into. And when we look at our survey respondents' experience, in some ways it does seem to kind of mirror the level of experience that our local companies are actually looking for. So, a large portion of our UX community has a wealth of experience, 3 to 6 years on six years or more. And we just had a very few, handful of respondents who had just, kind of starting out like entry level amount of experience. So now I'm going to hand things over to Kat, and she's going to talk more about what we do.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. So there are a lot of different facets that constitute UX design, as we all kind of know. So we wanted to ask the community of practitioners who responded what they actually do at work and how much time they spend doing those things. So that breaks down, maybe, there we go, here in this chart, where you can see that we asked everyone to divide their day up into percentages of time spent doing these tasks. Most of our time over there on the left was spent doing wireframing. Though among the people who manage people management is the top priority for those respondents. Among, as far as every other task is concerned, they don't necessarily do those. They spend most of their time in people management. The next is visual design, and then it kind of starts trickling off into different kinds of research and collaboration, testing, UX strategy, and then at the very, very end is UX writing and front-end development. I think at least front-end development is definitely something that we expected to see on the lower end, since that's not necessarily the job title, but there's always that employer who's looking for the unicorn who can do it all. So once we gathered sort of this data, Amy and I thought it would be really interesting to see how that changed since the pandemic started. So 54% of the people who responded did say that there was some kind of change, whether that was positive or negative. And we have some quotes from the survey. What's happening? There we go. So one person responded, I have less user interaction. Another person said that there was more team collaboration and facilitation, less usability testing. Another person said that their time was being reallocated to more internal facing efforts, like maintaining their design system and doing documentation. Someone said that they had less time for design and testing and were doing just more research-based projects. One person has been doing a lot more people management, more meetings, more time on the phone, and less time actually designing. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Somebody did say that most of their interviewing was done through WebEx before, so doing it through WebEx now as a necessity wasn't necessarily anything that disrupted their flow. And so we combed through those local job descriptions that Amy was talking about earlier, pulling out the skills that employers said that they were looking for. And you can see here in this word cloud that mock-ups, prototypes, and wireframes are all pretty high on the list, which corresponds pretty close with the chart from earlier that said that we spend a lot of our time doing wireframes and visual design. And then we standardized the terms on that list and kind of ranked them every time they appeared. And that gave us this chart. One thing that was really interesting, like you'll see like on the left-hand side, all of those things that were more visual, more a deliverable that seems a little bit more tangible were high on the list of things that they were asking for. But UX strategy actually never came up in any of the job descriptions. But as far as how we were spending our time, we reported that as the 5th ranked item. So we weren't necessarily sure, you know, is that something that's implied in we're posting a UX position, or is it something that most employers don't value or look for when they're thinking about hiring their next UX practitioner? And then using those same buckets, we love those buckets, we asked people for their perceived strengths and weaknesses. So you'll see green are the strengths and red are the weaknesses. Probably luckily for some, the amount of time that we spend doing the things that we're good at is pretty high, and the amount of time that we spend doing things that we don't necessarily feel good at is pretty low. And it was actually almost an exactly inverse relationship among the community here. So there's a pretty strong, you know, commonality between all of us. And then I'll pass it back to Amy to talk about experience and salary.
Need to unmute myself. Thanks, Kat. So we looked at all of the roles, job titles that our participants reported and kind of standardized them, in terms of like the product designer versus UX designer, categorize those into designer and then the senior level designer, etc. So this chart just really is kind of illustrating the range of roles and the frequency of roles that our participants had. And then we did ask about salary range, and we had a top kind of range of over 120. We didn't go any more granular beyond that, but you can see from this, specifically this pie chart, actually, that we are a very well-paid group with over half of us making in the over $100,000 range, and then a good chunk of us in the 80 to 100 range and 60 to 80 as well. And Kat's going to talk about job quality.
Yeah, so aside from things like what kind of work we're going to be doing and how much we're going to make, job perks are another way that an employer can distinguish themselves. So we asked respondents to self-report on the perks that their jobs offer. And that's how we got to this word cloud here. So we started out and we asked people, what perks did you have before the pandemic? And so we got a lot of responses. You would expect work from home is a really big one. Travel is a really big one. And then we asked them how perks have changed. Many of them disappeared, including things like comp to meals, team outings, the typical things that you would think about. If you're not in the office, you're not going to have access to the coffee machine or anything like that. Other things shifted to the virtual world, with people reporting that their happy hours or conferences moved to video calls. And a few people reported that things like their flexible schedule had become even more flexible, so their perk increased instead of decreasing. But then something like work from home, which also increased, a lot of people reported that since it became a mandatory practice, it didn't really seem like a perk at all anymore. And then we asked people how important that they thought having job perks were. And on the whole, 64% of people said that perks were either very important or extremely important. And less than 2% said that it wasn't at all important to them. But some of the perks that were reported were like health insurance and retirement plans, as well as, those work-life balance kind of perks. So I think it's pretty easy to see why it's important to a lot of us, because it's sort of the only way that we can survive in America. And then we're going to pass it back to Amy one more time to talk about UX maturity. Amy, you're muted still.
I missed the button. So we asked our participants to basically rate their companies or the last company that they had worked at in terms of how mature they felt the company was. And we used Dan Saffer's UX maturity scale as kind of a mechanism for ranking that. And if you're not familiar with it, basically at the bottom of the step ladder, a company that has a low kind of UX maturity is what Saffer is calling lacking UX awareness, may not be aware of what it involves or the value. And then moving on up, you have an ad hoc UX approach where there are initial signs of UX awareness. Then that moves up into a project UX, which where UX begins to be seen by the business as more of an advantage, and it's a little bit more strategic. And then business UX, building on that, is where it's user experience is a lot more integrated. Projects are approached on that business-wide level. And then after that, you move into the strategic UX culture, where it's a recognized and holistic part of the process. There's more of a strategic culture. And then you've got kind of the holy grail holistic UX culture at the top, where it's just baked in to the way that the business operates. and there is a customer-centric company culture. And so our respondents perceive their companies as, I would say, fairly mature on that ladder in terms of, having a strategically integrated, which is this kind of second to top rung, or a business UX, which is the third to top rung. But then we still have a fair number where it's more of like a project-based type of practice. We even have, a chunk, 5%, that feel their companies are really lacking in that awareness. And then, interestingly, a very, very small portion where they feel like they've really reached that top rung of the holistic UX culture. And then we also ask questions just around like, what is the highest level of UX leadership in your company? And a fair number of people reported having a director, head, group manager. There were some senior directors and VPs even, which to us seems to really indicate a mature UX practice. But then we still also have a few one-man shops and a few places where the designer or a principal designer is actually leading, which could potentially indicate a one-man shop as well. But definitely the majority having an established practice, just judging from the leadership level. And then we asked how that maturity might have changed during COVID. And based on the responses, which were open-ended, we tagged those as kind of a positive influence or negative, and then the neutral or no change, kind of like similar, I guess, but no change, people were specifically saying there was not a change. And then the neutral, it was just sort of like, was not a good or bad change overall, even though there had been change. So it was good to see that there were, a fairly good percentage of positive changes that had come out. But then, there are also some really severe consequences, as you can imagine, as well. So just some of the comments around the positive changes, just more efficiency and collaboration, some added maturity because of the circumstances, and then also improvements in terms of UX even leading a transformation, and more of a customer experience focus. The integration of new tools, that was a theme that cropped up quite a bit, just as we were all learning to work together remotely. Eliminating the geographic barriers, another byproduct of working together remotely, definitely can be a very positive influence. And then the remote testing skills just becoming, better and better, really opening up, I think, kind of the realm of research participants that you can reach out to as well. But then, as I mentioned, obviously there are just some really dire consequences as well. Some people reported UX really becoming a back burner practice. And then resources, people being stretched really thin, losing a lead and not ever regaining them. So that lack of leadership, losing people from the UX group due to cuts that a lot of companies faced, a lack of career path, sort of feeling a little stagnant, and going into a survival mode where UX really becomes sort of not a part of the critical function of the company. So Kat's gonna dive into our demographics.
Yeah, so now that we kind of know who all of us are as employees, we also wanted to know about the individuals in our community as people. And we wanted to also compare that with the larger community that we were a part of, aka the city of Cincinnati, using census data from 2010, because 2020 is not available yet. So our respondents were able to self-describe on their gender identities, and everyone fell into the binary system of male or female. We had a little bit more than half reporting as female, and out of the 80 people who chose to respond, 5 total people also chose to include pronouns, which we thought was pretty interesting. 4 of those people reported being she/her, and then 1 was a he, him, which kind of just speaks, to the climate that we are, slowly edging into. And our gender diversity was actually pretty close to the 2010 census results. For the city of Cincinnati, 51.6% of respondents are female, and ours was 58%. So that's not too bad considering our sample size. We also asked people to report on their ages. And given that we were surveying professionals in the industry, the age range of 22 to 59 is pretty expected. It covers pretty much from college graduation to retirement. There's definitely a spike in the mid-30s, which was really interesting to us. And people who grew up during the dot-com bubble, which would be these people who were around 9 to 16 between 1995 and 2001. So that could sort of relate to, growing up in this internet age and sort of seeing a lot of evolution of products throughout the years. Unfortunately, the census doesn't tell us any detailed results on age ranges. It's pretty much, are you under 5, are you under 18, or are you over 65? So we couldn't really compare that, with the city of Cincinnati. But back to what Amy was talking about earlier about a lot of positions that are for more mature or seasoned professionals. But there's this little surge, here in the 22, 23, 25, 26 age range of people who are fairly new and trying to, grow in their careers. And we don't really have much of a way for them to get in on the UX community as far as job postings go. So that was something that we thought should probably be addressed by the community as a whole to sort of bring up that next generation of UX professionals. And unlike gender, our UX community of respondents was very different from the general makeup of Cincinnati when we asked them about race. So when you look at this chart, the gray lines are product designers and orange is the Cincinnati census. So over 50% of Cincinnatians are white, but our population is over 86% white. And the second largest population is Black or African American. And our community of respondents didn't even crack 3%. I think that, given our sample size, the other races would vary pretty naturally. But this African American area is just extremely deficient compared to Cincinnati as a whole. And so clearly we're excelling in some areas of diversity and we're falling behind in some others. So we asked our respondents if they thought that their UX teams were diverse in an open text field. And we sort of charted out their results here on most people said yes or no, but others went into more detail. And so we found that detail really interesting because they would talk about why they thought that their teams were or were not diverse. And they would call out things like ethnicity or race, and they would call out things like gender. And that hit the majority of people. So they're like, oh, well, if we don't have any people of color, then we're not diverse. But they didn't necessarily think about all the other ways that people can, or a team can be diverse. So the next ones after that were age and cultural backgrounds. But it's a pretty sharp drop between gender and age. And so we all know that there's lots of different types of diversity, and maybe, that was just what they were thinking about that day, but I think it's pretty telling as far as what people think about when they think about diversity. And so then we took, all of those responses and sort of rated them on a amazing, good, neutral, or bad chart, and asked them to rate their team's diversity. And you can see that very few people chose to rate their teams as amazing in diversity. and most people chose either neutral or bad. So we know what we saw in that chart earlier about the lack of diversity, and we see that happening in our teams. And according to us, that is something that we want to change. So we asked them how important it was that their team was diverse. And the majority of people thought that it was at the very least very important. But it's possible that people scored more harshly in that prior slide because it is something that's important to them. But we can all kind of see that diversity is important to us, but we're not seeing it in our teams. And then finally, we asked everyone to tell us what it was about UX that drove them to choose that field for their profession. And we made a word cloud of the open text response. And so you can see here that design is a really big one. Research, solving problems appeared a lot, but so did helping, understanding, creating, connecting, and collaborating. These passion areas are conveniently things that also make great UX practitioners, but they also aren't unique to people who choose a particular education path. We can find those kinds of people in many places, and we think that they'll bring a new diversity of thought to our community as a whole. So that concludes our research. So if anyone has any questions, we're open.
I thought that was a really fantastic presentation. Thanks for sharing it. I thought it was really insightful, and I love that you're able to incorporate how those trends have changed with the pandemic. And be interesting as we kind of go into this next phase of some offices going back to being in person or partial, and some staying remote, how those trends would continue to change. So it'd be interesting to see how these trends may change over the next year or two. I like Mark has a question in the chat, I think, and this is following up on the diversity that you had, is how can we encourage and develop future designers and like really drive more toward that diversity in our area. I think that's really good for us to all ponder, and how we can encourage more diversity in our organizations. It looks like we have a question from Ronnie. Great presentation. How can we make the function more strategic in a corporation? Amy or Kat, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a challenging one. Actually, I would kind of open it up to the entire audience as well. I mean, I think that strategic importance is growing. I mean, I see it in my own company, Paycor. I feel like every year we become a more integral part of the process. I don't know. Do others have thoughts on how we can increase the strategic factor of UX?
I think a lot of it has to do with instead of preaching about doing it, because sometimes people have a hard time translating concept into action. So each company has their own execution level differently. So no matter how much we preach, hey, UX can be strategic, UX can be a great value to the company, they have a hard time thinking about how does that work. So it's almost like to me, it seems more like a ninja approach where you come in, you do the work, and you drive the initiative and the strategic level. And then after you've done that, you kind of circle back and say, here's this project that we come in. Imagine it without the UX portion of it, we would not reach this goal, that goal, the other goal. So it's more like you can only connect the dots backward, as Steve Jobs said. So when you tell people to connect the dot forward, they have a harder time than when you already done it and then connect it backward for them and show them the real live example. It's not as simple as that too, because sometimes you have to win influence first and raise your hand and do that kind of side of the desk job where you're already doing your user UX stuff, but you also raise your hand and say, hey, I look at that initiative and I see that nobody raised their hand. Can I be a part of it? And it's going to be hard at first because it's additional work, but I think that's how you drive it in practice.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing, I don't know if you guys can hear me. This is Ronnie.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for that's a great answer. You know, one thing that I learned, I just recently transitioned to a new role from my last company. And one thing that I have instituted is start measuring the customer experience metrics, some of the KPIs. And once we start establishing that and then track it versus some of the new UX changes that has been happening, then you know, to the point made earlier, you can kind of start to correlate, right? And then suddenly you start to get some seat on the table. Maybe then just get some budget because all of these are related, right? The more strategic you become, more money hopefully will come in your way, more headcounts you will get, and those kind of things. But the first thing that I have noticed is start measuring. A lot of time, just the KPIs are kind of missing. You know, simple things like NPS or any other KPIs that could be on your side that can make your story. So that's just wanted to add that piece from my side.
Yeah, I feel like it can be challenging though to identify those really convincing metrics or figure out exactly what to measure. I'm kind of curious what types of metrics people have had success with.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just tell you mine and then I'll wait. I'm happy to hear the answer. So, you know, like these customer experience companies have started, you know, like this NPS, how likely are you to recommend? You just ask that one question, but then it has a whole battery of others. Of course, it costs money for us to just go back to the customer and ask them at every channel, and every call center, for example, is a big channel for us. But then they do ask the experience about, you know, the .com portal or whatever the designing was done. And then we kind of break it down by kind of the step or the module, which module had the biggest, NPS. We have CSS, which is customer satisfaction. Then that's another metric that we do. Then we can probe some of them, you know, in a free form text as well. So that's just you know, what we do in our case.
We are customers of UserZoom, and so we're currently working with them as a consultant to bring in their QX score, which is a way of measuring the experience. So we're in the very early stages of that. So I can share more as we evolve further with that. Keith, I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts. I know you've done some, I think, similar but different research in these areas, and I was just curious, like how, with you being outside of the direct Cincinnati area but connected to this area and connected across Ohio, like just any differences and themes that you've observed across more broadly looking past Cincinnati.
Yeah, I didn't catch it all, Chris, because I was eating dinner and doing other things, but I definitely had you guys on in the background. So I heard some things here and there. Definitely, you know, things around the education, right? It's kind of hard to survey people around education because we're coming from lots of different backgrounds, and like, what the heck is a UX degree anyway, right? There's like 5 different kinds of UX degrees, right? So that's probably the hardest part about this, is trying to make sense of the data when the like what we're asking people is still confusing, right? So that's just sort of the hardest thing to me, is like to draw too many conclusions when it's like, oh, like we didn't have anybody with an HCI degree in our pool of things. Oh, well, that skewed us one way, right? Just because, right? So I'll have to go back and look some more before I can make any more sense, because I think I missed some of the good stuff, but I just wanted to mostly listen in on how, what you were surveying. I'm trying to get trying to do something similar like up in Michigan, right? Again, surveying folks, collecting information, ideally do it for like 2 or 3 years in a row, so that even if we have, we may not learn some of these things until we can look at it over like a 3-year period and say, oh, now it makes sense that like this number never moves. That tells us one thing, but if this number goes up and down every year, then we know it means something else, right? So
yeah, that actually would be really interesting to send out the survey again in another year or two and just compare the data for sure.
Yeah, and I think thinking of like UXPA and IxDA and those other groups, sometimes they do broader national surveys, and so I try to keep an eye on those just to like see what sort of questions they're asking and which sort of questions are like, that question wasn't worth asking or whatever, right?
Yeah,
So I think it'd be ideal in some point if we could sort of share our data from lots of different places and start to compare, because I notice, for other professions, I've been doing research for other things where I can go like right now I'm having to research DevOps, right? And so like the DevOps community has been doing surveys for like 10 years on what it means to be in DevOps and what the roles are and how it's changing, right? Because somebody funded it, right? Somebody funded it for 10 years to do it. Google funded it or somebody else, I don't remember who, right? So I think if we could try to make some of those happen, but in the meanwhile, right, just keep doing lots of our little things in different communities, and let's start adding up the numbers and comparing notes and see what we can find.
Yep.
Thanks, Keith.
So sorry, I didn't have a good answer. So
no, great. Thanks for your perspective on it. Does anybody else have questions for Amy and Kat? Or even thoughts to add to the overall discussion?
So one thing, this is Ronnie again, I may have missed that. There was a question on, on the degree or, what area of field of study, right? Something of that nature. Was there a question around like when or how did they move to this area? Because one thing that I have found that very few of us, especially on the matured side, would have this kind of a degree, right? Because it was not there when we were in college, for example. But traditional market research or psychology, and they have moved. So I think that was a question. Can you comment on what kind of field they kind of moved in from to this UX role? I think it was mostly psychology or some.
We had some data that I spoke to you around the 20% of our respondents who had no type of design related degree, and okay. It was a pretty broad range, but we didn't ask any specific questions around like how they made that transition into UX, but that would be a really interesting area to explore as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just from my informal talking to people, right? Some of them was like frustrated in with their other job, right? It's like, I tried this job for 5 years and I hated it, right? So that's one. Sometimes it's just, this thing sounds cooler, right? There's definitely some that I think you can map it as like, is part of their career path, right? Like they started out as an architect, right? But they were always into tech or whatever. So you could tell they were eventually to get to UX. They just, like you said, they couldn't get to school and get that degree, or they didn't know it existed. But you can sort of, when you talk to them, you can say, like, yeah, you were going to end up here just fine. And then other ones are like a complete accident. Nope, just because I met my neighbor one day and he mentioned it. Otherwise I would have never gotten here, right? So
yeah.
We did get a couple responses in the like what drove people to pursue UX, which was the last chunk that we talked about. Like some people did talk about, like I started out building websites as a hobby, or I'm in marketing and I don't think marketing tactics are nice. So there was a little bit of that we got, but not necessarily a specific question around that. But we did get a couple little anecdotal things. And then when you were even asking that question, I thought it'd be nice to ask people how they geographically got here as well, since there's probably some transplants.
Yep.
You mean to Cincinnati? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah, and especially for me would be like, how many people moved to the area for a UX job, or did they move here for some other reason and then discovered UX? Or because I think from like the economic development folks would like, they're always like, we need more software developers in the area or whatever, right? And so if we could have a little bit of data that says like how many folks are moving to the Cincinnati area to get a UX or design type job, right? And compare that with some of the other jobs that they're tracking. And we still might be small, but at least if we're on the radar map that somebody's counting us, that's a start.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting.
And then for like the larger companies like Kroger, right? Because Kroger's bragging about how they're both developing local talent, but also bringing in other talent, right? And so maybe it's just what do the Kroger numbers look like? What do the Procter and Gamble numbers look like? That could be a start. That might be easier to count than all the 3-person design agencies that brought somebody into town as their fourth person. That's hard to count.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're right at 7, so want to be respectful of everybody's time. But thank you so much for coming and listening to us present the data. Thank you to everybody that took the survey, because we know it was long. But yeah, it's been a really fun project to work on, and love all of the kind of insights about how we might take it further as well. So I do want to mention that in July, we are not going to be hosting a meetup, but we will be resuming in August. And I think I just closed my calendar. Was it the 25th, Chris?
Yes, August
Okay.
25th.
Yep. And so we'll be resuming our regular meetup schedule in August, and we have a great presenter lined up who's going to be talking about kind of the intersection between the immigrant experience and kind of the building empathy and UX design. And I wish I had a better description than that, but we're sort of still working with her on getting all of the details for that. But she's a fantastic presenter, so I'm sure you will enjoy the talk, and we'll get out the details as soon as we have more on that. So thank you again, and have a great night.
Thanks again.
Thank
That
you.
was a fantastic presentation, Amy and Kat. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.